Hey everyone, it's Adam with yet another What's New in MixEffect. Today we're going to talk about the newly released MixEffect 1.2, as well as touch on some of the features that were released in the previous two versions of MixEffect, which I did not do a video on. So without further ado, let's get started. The most important thing in MixEffect 1.2 are the SuperSource improvements, and I think you are going to love them. So the first thing is custom speeds for your presets. What does that mean? You can now set a custom speed from a preset that's different from the default. So let's say the default speed is fast, but you wanted to have a preset that when you recall it, does the transition instantly. Now you can do that. Let's take a quick look at what that looks like. So we're going to go to SuperSource here, and we see the iPad screen. And let's say we wanted to switch to this iPad screen. And right now you can see in the upper left-hand corner of the SuperSource visual editor, I have the little rabbit, and that is the fast speed. If you don't see the rabbit, real quick, you can go to your settings, you can go to user interface, and you can click on the show transition speed menu. And that will make the transition speed menu appear in your SuperSource visual editor. So if I transition to the 1:12 camera plus iPad, you'll see it does the fast transition. If I go back here, back to that. So let's say we wanted to make this an instant transition. Here's how you do that. A new feature in MixEffect 1.2 is that you can long press on a preset in the presets tab, and instead of saving the current preset, which is what it did in previous versions, it now displays a menu. And you can go quickly, you can save the current layout to the preset, or you can edit the preset. Here we're going to edit the preset, and we see use custom speed right here. So if you toggle this, you can now set a speed for your animation. So in this case, I will choose instant, and I will go and save this. And now you see over here, we have a little lightning bolt icon, because that means that this preset has a custom speed for instant. So now when I click on it, you see that the transition happened automatically, and there is no moving of the boxes. If we go back to this one will use the default speed, which again is the rabbit. So it's the fast one. You see how that works. Go back, instant, go back, uses the fast transition. So now with your presets, you can set them up to your heart's content and set a custom speed. Great. Now, let's go take a look at what's new. Preset run macro and preset exit macro. Yes, you can now run macros when you recall your presets or when you leave from a preset. This is a very exciting feature that I will demonstrate right now. So we're going to duplicate this. And what we're going to do is I'm going to unlock the visual editor, and I'm going to move this guy. Let's see. I'm going to move him over here, and I'll move him over there. So I'm going to save this layout. I'm going to tap Command S, and I'm going to edit this, and I'm going to call this, let's say, iPad. Call this pip plus iPad. Okay, and I want to run a macro when it goes to that macro. So when it goes to that preset. So I'm gonna enable the run macro toggle right here. And before I do that, we actually have to do one thing. I'm gonna just save this. Because you can now run your macros with your presets, but your presets are shared across all of your switchers. It's part of MixEffect, not part of like a particular switcher that you have. You have to be careful. You don't want to have a preset that runs a macro on one switcher that runs the same indexed macro on another switcher, because that macro might be completely different. So if you go to your switcher section, you'll see, scroll down here, you'll see a toggle that's enable SuperSource Macros. If that's toggle, you'll have all the controls for running macros with your presets. But if you have another ATEM Mini Extreme, which has SuperSource, so let's just create another one right here. And I'll call this number 2. Say add. Now if we look down here, we do not have enable SuperSource Macros here. So if this is enabled or not enabled, and I connect to this switcher, which we'll do right here. So we're connected to the exact same ATEM Mini Extreme ISO, but we don't have enable SuperSource Macros turned on. So if we go to SuperSource and we look back on that preset that I just created, And I will filter my presets by saying what's new. And let's see, where is it? It's this one, 12 pip plus iPad. And I long press and I'll say edit. You'll see that you only have the option for use box sources or boxes and custom speed. The macro run and macro exit aren't visible. So if you want them visible, you must toggle that enable SuperSource macro toggle right here. So we're going to reconnect to this A10 Mini Extreme that has the toggle turned on. We'll go back and we will go edit this preset one more time. So let's say we wanted to run a macro. Let's do something very simple. Let's see, let's go back here. Let's go here. Let's do DSK auto. And then when we exit, we're going to run the same macro. Now, this is a very simplistic example, but it'll give you a good idea of what's happening. So we'll click save here. And the downstream keyer, DSK1, is using media player 1. And this is actually a pre-multiplied image. So we can see what happens when I make it go on air. You'll see the MixEffect logo come here. So what the macro DSK auto does is, let's run it. It just runs a downstream keyer auto action. And real quick, a side note, in the macro section, you now have actually the numbers of each macro in the bottom right corner of the buttons, and also in list view here. You'll see them in the far right. And that's because if you had icons defined, the button numbers have disappeared. So now I actually show the button numbers at all times. So coming back to that SuperSource, we see that if we have the downstream keyer turned on, which let's say we're on this one, so we'll go to this one. Okay, so if we go to this 12 pip iPad, it will turn on the DSK. Okay, you see that? And if we leave from it, it should turn it off right there because it's running the same macro for exiting and leaving. But let's say we want to do something a little different for the exit. So let's say, for instance, we wanted to, I'm going to edit this preset, and I will change this macro to, let's see. Let's do something fun by just doing a fade to black. Should be interesting. Okay, so when this exits, when I leave this preset, it should fade everything to black, which is kind of not what I want to do because it does a lot of other things, but we'll see what happens. And I'm back. And as you can see, the downstream keyer is still on because I wasn't running the DSK auto macro. So we don't want that to happen. So I'm going to actually turn that off, turn this off, and I'll just turn this off as well. So I am doing a live stream on Friday to demonstrate another new feature in MixEffect 1.2, which is the native companion module for MixEffect. Very excited to release this. I have the developer, Johnny Estias, who's going to be joining me on Zoom and on YouTube via Zoom ISO, and we're going to have a wonderful discussion. So what that's going to be, real quick, I'm going to show you these presets here. I've set up this whole kind of system on my Stream Deck that's going to run the show. And as you can see over here, these presets here have various scripts attached to them. So I have the Stream Zoom Intro Media Player 2. If we take a look at this, we'll see that when it runs, it's going to run a macro called Stream Intro Start. And when it exits, it's going to run the Stream Intro End macro that I've defined. And then when it goes to camera 2 or 02 camera, it's going to run this Intro Live macro. And I have some other examples of macros that run over here. So this is a USK 5 grid zoom ISO. This is actually a very exciting feature that uses this one macro, which uses the upstream keyer to display a 5th pseudo SuperSource box. So we can actually take a look at how this works. So real quick here, we have source 1 is the 5D Mark IV, source 2 is Zoom ISO 1, source 3 is Zoom ISO 2, source 4 right now says Xbox, but it's actually a Zoom ISO 3, and then we'll have the 5th box be Zoom ISO 4. So watch what happens if I push this button. Now remember, SuperSource normally shows 4 boxes at a time. Unless you have a constellation using the cascade feature, then you can show 8 boxes at a time. But with this SuperSource and a USK and a macro that runs when your preset is executed, you can do something like this. So obviously there's no boxes, there's no sources here, but if I just go and show my box controls, and I can say set that one to the iPad, set this one to, let's say, bars, set box 4 to color 1. If we go to the upstream keyer, I can set this one to color 2. Imagine those being Zoom ISO sources or other cameras. Now you can have, a 5-grid SuperSource. But that's not all. The A10 Mini Extreme can have 2 USKs showing a DVE. So I could do something like this. Now I have 6 boxes showing up on time. Now, the 2 other boxes in the bottom right corner don't animate, although you could probably use the flying key to kind of like move it in, but you'd have to code that into the macro. That's beyond the scope of this demonstration here. But it's very exciting because now you can just, with one press, you can go back to the 5-grid. And the way this one is working is that if you look at the 6-grid preset, I'm running 2 macros. 1, an entrance macro, the 6-grid, and 2, the 6-grid off macro. And what that will do is I'll just make those 2 boxes disappear. And then the 5-grid one will run, and it has an entrance macro of making one of the USK boxes appear. So if we go back and forth, you'll see that it moves, looks pretty good. It's not quite SuperSourcey, but it's not bad. And I'm also using a custom speed. I'm using the filled rabbit, which is the extra fast speed to do the transition. So you kind of hide that turning on and off the USK boxes. So a very exciting way that I think you can take advantage of this running macros on recalling the preset and when you're leaving the preset. So I encourage you to take a look at that feature. Okay, so I'm going to make that downstream keyer disappear. So there's some other UI improvements. You've already seen kind of like the little labels that appear below the SuperSource boxes. There's also kind of like a highlighted area. So it makes it a little easier to see which one is the selected preset. Before it was just kind of like a little orange border, which still exists, but now you have a little highlight around that. There's also in the detail view, which is a feature from a previous version of MixEffect, post 1.1.1, which shows you a lot more information about your presets. So let's take a look at that real quick. Bring that up here. And this is a great way for you to, if you're running a show, you could just have this on the detail view and it'll show you exactly what sources will become active when you run the SuperSource. So we saw earlier over here, the 5D4 is box 1 and box 3 is the media player 2. In the switcher interface, you also get kind of the highlight around that and you get the little icons on what's going to happen. That this one has an entrance script and an exit script, and this one has a custom animation speed of instant. All right, let's go back here. Let's take a look at what else is new. More user interface changes. So if we go back to the switcher, there's one quick change that was introduced in MixEffect 1.1.2, I believe, and I will show you right now. So I'm going to go edit the switcher page, see if I can actually tap that, make it appear. So if you use the wide input labels, so let's say program preview wide, and I'm going to edit this and move that up there. And let's just get rid of this one here. You'll see now that for the wide input labels, it's showing the full source name. So instead of 5D4, it now says 5D Mark IV, iPad, iPhone, Apple TV, Xbox, Zoom ISO 2 and 1. And you can always change these source labels if you go to Settings source labels, and you can change what these labels are. So, 5D Mark IV, and then the small label is this. So this is a good way if you use the wide input labels to see kind of like the whole input. If you use an ATEM Mini Pro or Mini Pro ISO and you only have one auxiliary port, you won't have this cross-point switcher because you only have one, so you won't need to see those extra things. Talked about the macros. Oh, another great thing is new keyboard shortcut overlays. So I finally figured out how to get these overlays to work. So if you hold down the command key on an external keyboard on your iPad, you can see all the command key shortcuts. And there are a lot. You can turn on basically all the DSK, auto, on air, and tie just from the keyboard. You can actually switch between different media stills just from the keyboard. So I encourage you to take a look at that. Depending on the section that you're in, the keyboard shortcuts will change. So if I'm in the SuperSource section here and I hold down the command key, you'll see that there's a bunch of commands that are specific to the SuperSource section. Okay. And again, if you go like the downstream here, you hold this down, you'll see different things here. So definitely check that out. New OSC commands and shortcut actions. So within OSC, if you've been using MixEffect 1.1.3 and take advantage of the media player still and clip features, there's been a change to them. The arguments for them have flipped. So before it was specify your media player and then your still index, but now I flipped them to the still index and then the media player. And that's more just to be consistent with the other OSC commands that I have. But if you haven't taken advantage of those commands, you don't have to worry about that because now they're documented and they're in the new native companion module. So you don't have to worry about kind of like what command you need to send. You just need to choose it from the list and then enter your parameters. It's really exciting. You're going to really love that live stream on Friday. So tune in. Other OSC commands that I've added, the aforementioned media player still and clip. You can cycle between the clips and cycle in reverse. So that's actually what I'm doing here. I have these companion buttons that are just, I push them and it goes back a still and goes forward a still. I have an auto and cut command. So now you can basically do auto and cut transitions. I used to have, and I still have, a SuperSource auto and cut transitions, but those just did an auto and cut back and forth between preview and SuperSource. And now this one is auto and cut between what's in program and preview on your ATEM. I'll go into this more on Friday, but it looks like I'll probably be adding a lot more OSC commands to MixEffect, so you can basically control everything on your ATEM, at least most everything on your ATEM from OSC, just like I do from the actual application itself and from within shortcuts. So speaking of shortcuts, there's some exciting new shortcuts. Now I know a lot of people probably haven't taken advantage of shortcuts, but I really encourage you to do so because it's really powerful. So let's take a look at what we can do. I'm going to bring in this shortcut here and I'm going to do a search for configure ATEM. So I've written a shortcut that called configure ATEM that basically configures my ATEM Mini Extreme for 3 different purposes. I have streaming, Zoom ISO, and the occasional game that I play on the Xbox. So what I'm going to do here is just run you through what's happening in this shortcut. So the first thing it's going to do is going to run the MixEffect switcher active, which basically, if you're running a shortcut from the Shortcuts app and MixEffect is not running, or you were in the background, MixEffect was in the background and you ran the shortcut, it will open up MixEffect and say, hey, wait until the switcher has connected and then continue running the shortcut. And then what it's going to do is going to prompt you a list. What do you want to configure the ATEM for? You want to configure it for streaming, Zoom ISO, or gaming. It's going to take that choice and it's basically going to say, if your choice is streaming, run this other shortcut, which is config ATEM for streaming. And then it's going to run another shortcut, which is set source name, which is going to set the source labels for my buttons, Apple TV and Xbox. And then it's going to configure my multi-view to be exactly how I want it to be. If it's the choice was Zoom ISO, it's going to run configure ATEM for Zoom ISO, which is going to set a bunch of kind of audio channels, turn them on and off, or to the AFV mode, and it's also going to set the source labels. And then it's going to configure my multi-view to be Zoom ISO mode. And then for gaming, it's going to do something very similar. So I'm going to run this and show you what happens. And we'll see what happens in the source list up here on the ATEM switcher. So I'm going to click done. I'm going to tap this. I'm going to say zoom ISO. So what just happened, and I'm going to bring myself back here. What just happened is that it configured a bunch of things on my ATEM, including kind of getting the kind of title slide up and running and switching to that SuperSource, which is why kind of the screen disappeared. It configured my multi-view, which I can show you what the multi-view looks like here. So this is my multi-view. When I ran the zoom ISO configuration shortcut. And what it did was it reconfigured my multi-view so that the zoom inputs were all in the upper left box on the ATEM Mini Extreme ISO. And that's because I'm going to position my monitor, which is right here, right below my camera, so that when I look at the zoom ISO boxes and talk to people, it looks like I'm talking to them. And then right below, I have the 5D4, the iPad, my iPhone, and my Mac. I have program feed in the upper right, and I have SuperSource preview and the two media players in the bottom right. But if I was running my default layout, which I do when I'm streaming, and we'll just run this, you'll see that it reconfigured my multi-view now, program and preview at the top, which is kind of a classic configuration, and it has the 5D4, iPad, iOS, and Mac. Those are my four primary sources because I'm not zooming with anyone in my default configuration. I have the media player 2, SuperSource, and the audio settings. And you can see if we take a look at this shortcut, it basically does this. If the default setting is, it's basically one action, set multi-view advanced settings, and it's set the layout. And you can see all the 16 types of layouts that you get with the ATEM Mini Extreme, ATEM Mini Extreme ISO, and the ATEM Constellation 8K. If you don't have one of those, if you have, say, an ATEM 1ME Production Studio or Television Studio, you can run another action, which is the Set Multi-View Settings. And you have the option of 4 different layouts: program top, bottom, left, and right. And if you have an ATEM Mini Pro or Mini Pro ISO, unfortunately, you don't get too much to configure with the multi-view, so these two actions won't work. But if you have an ATEM Mini Extreme, this is very powerful. Now, you could code all these things into a macro as well and just recall them with a touch of a macro. But if you had to reprogram the macro every time, it gets very tedious. So I recommend creating a shortcut that does exactly what you want and then running it as a macro or recording it as a macro. And then if you ever wanted to make changes, you could just change them right here in your shortcut. Or you can create multiple shortcuts. It's very powerful what you can do. One thing that macros cannot do is set the source name. So I have another shortcut, which we saw earlier, which was set source name. So we're going to see how that works here. So I'm going to go to the switcher. And you see right here, I have my inputs are zoom ISO 4, 3, 2, and 1. I'm going to actually make this screen a little bigger so you can see them all. So I have zoom ISO 1, 2, 3, and 4. I actually have them reversed. And the reason why I do that is I may not bring in 4 Zoom participants every single time. So I put zoom ISO 1 on channel 8, and 2 on 7, 3 on 6, and 5 on 4. So that if I'm using, say, 5 for the Apple TV and 6 for like the Xbox, I can have them configured that way, and I still have my zoom ISOs 1 and 2 on 7 and 8. And then all my presets still work. So I don't have to like flip presets all around and stuff like that and change the box sources. So it's a good feature to do if you are taking advantage of zoom ISO. But now, let's say I'm running this set source name and I want to configure this to inputs 5 through 8. I'm going to say Apple TV and Xbox, and watch closely right here. It runs that, and now my source names have been changed. So now source 5 is now Apple TV, and source 6 is the Xbox. And setting the source name is not something you can do in a macro. So you can only do that from a shortcut. So I'm going to switch this back and say zoom ISO. And you'll see again that source names will change now to zoom ISO 4 and 3 right there. The new switcher and get switcher connection fields now returns information about the switcher, including the enable OSC port numbers and the enable SuperSource macros. So you can actually set those now from the new switcher command if you're creating switchers through shortcuts. So the last thing I want to talk about is a series of bug fixes that I've made. Macro names can now contain kind of extended characters and Unicode characters. So before there was a bug where if you typed in like some Chinese characters, it would like only take in like 2 of the characters. Now you can do the full 6 characters. So it's interesting. Macro names can have up to 20 characters, but some characters take more than 1 character. It's kind of like more than 1 byte. So Chinese characters take 3 bytes, so you can have 6 of them. So 3 times 6 is 18, and then you have 2 characters left to do like kind of like ASCII characters. So that has been fixed. So that's great for people who are using MixEffect in other languages. There's also a Chinese simplified localization that was introduced, I believe, in 1.1.1 or 1.1.2 or 1.1.3 of MixEffect. Other things to keep in mind is that some keyboard shortcuts do not work when you go into the sheet. So sheet is something like if you long press on something to kind of bring up a little pop-up view. So if I long press on the transition style, it'll bring this up. Keyboard shortcuts won't work because there's some confusion in Apple's iOS Swift UI kind of framework where that the views are still like stacked on top of each other. So if you have a keyboard shortcut that's defined in both places, it's inconsistent what actually happens. So I disable keyboards when you have the sheet open, but you'll probably just use your finger for that. There are some bugs in the detail view for presets where like the box sources weren't showing up properly, and that's been fixed. And also in MixEffect 1.1.2, you can now import SuperSource presets outside of the MixEffect folder in iCloud Drive. So this was a bug that was reported by a user, and that one has been fixed as well. So coming back, that's what's new in MixEffect 1.2. I hope you've enjoyed this video and that you subscribed. And if you haven't subscribed, click that subscribe button. One thing that's really great about the recent events of the past few weeks is that I reached 1,000 subscribers, which is a milestone if you're a YouTuber. There's a couple other people who do video production videos, Petra from Tech Condo and Ryan Summerfield. They also reached 1,000 subscribers. Keith Bennett is not far behind, and he does great videos on Hyperdeck and other things, ATEM and video production related. So go ahead and check out their channels and subscribe to them and help Keith get to 1,000 subscribers. He's been very great in helping to promote MixEffect, so I'm just paying it forward and trying to help him get to 1,000 so he can monetize and do all sorts of things that YouTube lets you do when you have 1,000 subscribers. With that, I will bid you good night. I hope you enjoy MixEffect 1.2 and be sure to tune in to the live stream happening this Friday where we're going to cover the MixEffect native companion module. Thank you, and we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.